and it'd rain, and the homestead shack leak. And here'd come Mrs. Blatt over to visit my mother. See, she had a good outfit over there, and she'd ride her horse over. She had them little Mustang horses, the Sioux ponies down here, and boy, she'd come. And my mother always figured she'd come over just to watch her put the pans under the drip. Oh, that didn't make Mother mad. She never did get over that. But she had a little Appaloosie mare. They'd come out of South Dakota, Sioux pony, and boy, she'd ride that little Appaloosie thing. It was a going thing.
Hundreds of years ago, a small band of horses broke free from Spanish explorers. Within months, the first foals were born. They joined the ranks of billions of horses born wild in North America and lived as horses have always lived on this continent. But their homeland was about to undergo unprecedented changes. This is their story. The story of the return of the horse. "55 million years ago, North America was clothed in lush, primeval forests. This was a world left behind by dinosaurs and giant flying reptiles. The moist forests gave birth to the dawn horse, Hyracotherium, the remote ancestor of all equids. These were small animals, 10 to 20 inches tall. Their padded feet were dog-like, with tiny hooves rather than claws. Their teeth were ideal for foraging on soft leaves, nuts, and berries. Over millions of years, they adapted to changes in climate, vegetation, and terrain, evolving into many distinct species. Equids of various sizes and shapes lived side by side and filled the Americas, overflowing into Europe and Asia. As ancient forests yielded to open plains, some equids adapted to the encroaching grasslands. They grew taller and developed a more horse-like body. These forerunners migrated to South America, Asia, Europe, and Africa, developing into many distinct species within the group or genus named Equus. Several species of the genus Equus are alive today. Zebras from Africa, the wild ass from North Africa and Asia, the Mongolian horse from Asia, and the modern horse from North America. Mongolian horses, wild asses, and zebras all share a common ancestor with the modern horse, yet they are entirely different species. The modern horse, Equus caballus, evolved exclusively in North America.
It is now clear today that the modern horse, Equus caballus, emerged in North America 1.4 to 1.6 million years ago, and that there was no evidence for the divergence of that species anywhere else in the world.
As ice caps melted and reformed, the Bering Land Bridge repeatedly appeared and disappeared, allowing for large horse migrations. The horse adapted to changes in climate, vegetation, and terrain, developing into many diverse populations, nature's equivalent of breeds. In spite of differences in appearance, all modern horses, wild or domesticated, belong to the same species, Equus caballus, the North American horse. Near the end of the last ice age, 13,000 years ago, humans were living in North America. For at least 5,000 years, they hunted horses for food and for hides. But for all humans, in North America as well as in Eurasia, horse domestication was still thousands of years away. The presence of humans coincided with a major North American megafauna extinction. Almost all of America's large mammals disappeared. The American camel, the saber-toothed tiger, the American mastodon all went extinct. But the North American horse did not suffer the same fate. Its enormous range spanned 5 continents. It died out in the Americas, but flourished in its other habitats. The horse, Equus caballus, was one of the few large North American wildlife species to evade extinction. The North American horse was to become the engine of civilization, but not in its own homeland. Over 5,000 years ago, the North American horse was domesticated in the Black Sea region of Asia. The horse quickly reshaped the human world, revolutionizing agriculture, hunting, transportation, and warfare. Armies on horseback traveled thousands of miles, conquering and assimilating. People and cultures intermingled, ideas flourished, technologies spread, and the world became smaller because of the horse. The Arabian and the North African barb are 2 of the oldest breeds. These short horses with small backs had naturally adapted to the harsh North African deserts. In the 8th century, the Moors of North Africa loaded them into boats and conquered Spain, ruling for almost 800 years. Their horses wore amulets in the shape of a crescent moon to ward off evil. In their efforts to expel the Moors, the Spaniards bred their own war horse in the province of Andalusia. The Spanish war horse was developed by crossing the Arabian and the barb, both known for endurance and agility, with larger northern horses which had the strength necessary to carry an armored rider. The Spanish war horses were highly trained and finely tuned for battle. They could be guided by knee pressure alone and could attack and trample an opponent on command. This was the horse that would soon repopulate the American wilderness. Its reintroduction was close at hand. Spain was about to strike the spark which would kindle centuries of European imperialism. In the 15th century, with the final expulsion of the Moors, the monarchs of Spain set out to expand their empire. They sponsored an Italian navigator on a voyage that would forever change the world. In 1492, Christopher Columbus stepped onto an island in the Caribbean, believing he had discovered a route to India. His arrival set off centuries of European colonization and the return of the horse to its native homeland. Beginning with the second voyage of Columbus, the holds of Spanish ships were crammed with horses, shackled and in slings. The Spaniards came for the gold, and they came for the salvation of souls, with swords and guns and war horses and war dogs.
When native peoples first saw the Spaniards when they came with the horses, the Spanish conquistadors were in their metal armor. The horses also had all the metal armor on it. So when they first saw this thing coming at them, which they had never seen, they were struck in awe because they didn't know what it was. And at first they were very frightened of it. And so the Spanish conquerors at the time then were able to take advantage of that point. They started to put bells on them, which then frightened the native peoples there, and just really kind of played on that fear.
Después de Dios, debían su victoria a los caballos.
This statement failed to credit the vast army of invisible microbes that blazed the path for a Spanish victory. Millions of native people were killed by European disease. America was settled by Europeans to the sound of bells. A century before the landing of the Mayflower, the sound of bells filled the valleys and bounced off canyon walls, forever changing the musical landscape of our continent. Thousands of bells adorned the sheep, cattle, pigs, and horses of New Spain. Along with bells, the Spanish horses wore amulets in the shape of a crescent moon. Decades before pilgrims landed in America, more than 500 Europeans had already settled in New Mexico, near Santa Fe. These Spanish settlements were connected to Mexico City by a central corridor, El Camino Real, the Royal Road. This was the route that first brought European culture to our country, and was a major thoroughfare for the return of the horse to North America. The Spaniards colonized the Pueblo Indians of New Mexico, imposing encomienda, a system of coerced labor. Franciscan missions and large ranches used Indians to breed horses and to tend to their vast herds of sheep and cattle, often on horseback. Outside the missions and ranches, horses were scarce, and the Spanish military was alarmed that many soldiers and settlers had no horses at all. The combination of breeding colonies, trained Indian riders, and an under-horsed military left this remote territory vulnerable. In 1680, this world suddenly exploded. Pueblo Indians revolted and expelled the Spaniards. Thousands of horses escaped into the wild and into the hands of native people. Once again, the North American horse ran free in its native homeland. Horses and horsemanship spread like wildfire across the American West. The Spanish war horse became Ponocamita, the elk dog, the sky dog, the Indian pony.
This horse transformed hunting, it transformed travel, it transformed warfare.
The horse, to the Plains Indians, was like a boat to people living on the edge of the sea. The horse allowed native people to harvest the bounty of the plains, and that bounty was the buffalo.
The buffalo was really important to migratory people as they followed the buffalo, because from the buffalo they sustained everything, not only food, but clothing, shelter. A good buffalo horse was highly prized. You could ride into the herd without fear from the buffalo. And the buffalo is noted as being able to turn very quickly. So a good buffalo horse that was not afraid of riding in there was really important.
The horse shifted the balance of power among tribes. Old enemies became allies, and old friends became enemies.
Se nuputahan tuke se tia haats nuputahan kuhashanhan tuke te se hinshami muhammaheikushami totis kahnami kutahni kuyachi se where mushumi shami tunis kemerka shami shkani takua se shati chakus kakrawa tu shate se yishakawayo te awekyan se he ashe isha shutni chaaja nihan hin totsia tani kem noacha ain tskam zira wasti hojam zish kotin atmio ima amochat iwas ku hekecha ku kuya sha hekesa ta tsetcha na bahutik ku mushumitik.
Mounted Plains warriors raided other Indian tribes, pillaging and taking slaves. Raids against Spaniards extended deep into New Spain, striking at the heart of Spanish colonialism.
From the south, horses were being traded. From the north, guns were being traded by the fur traders. And so when those two kind of intersect, that's where you get the mounted warrior. Particularly on the plains, you get this mounted warrior. They expand their areas and new conflicts start.
The Pueblo Indians suffered greatly from the intertribal slave trade and relentless assaults by mounted plains warriors. Only 12 years after the Pueblo Revolt, Pueblo Indians formed new alliances with the Spaniards, who then peacefully returned to New Mexico. Because the horse so greatly aids survival, time is freed for Native people. Native American art flourished. Beadwork, quillwork, and jewelry were made to honor the horse. Like the Spaniards and Moors, Native Americans decorated their horses with crescent moons. In time, the crescent moon would be embraced by the squash blossom.
No más hostia, kus noutsia mitju itä chest mitja de nasha mitju josa de nasha hemesha jausti tiat kem ameme a shayak otu cam chats get ox cam oya bombos chats to chats cam take ita wa canal at kupastia at baril tikana tsitstikаш oya bombos chats to chats quina mag he asha get ox kawayo.
Indian horses were semi-wild. They received minimal care, no shelter, and foraged for themselves. There was a constant exchange between Indian horse herds and wild horses. Many Indian horse herds were allowed to follow their natural biological programming. They organized to form tight-knit family groups essential to the survival of their species.
The basic social unit in the wild horse is the band. And most often that consists of a single sexually mature stallion and a number of mares and juveniles. At age 3, the young males are drummed out of the band, and most of the mares will leave also, and that's just to prevent inbreeding. There's a social hierarchy there. There's a lead mare. The stallion is there for breeding purposes and to protect the band from other stallions, but he makes no day-to-day important decisions. The lead mare decides when they're going to feed, where they're going to feed, when they're going to water, where they're going to water. Then we have the bachelor groups, and these are the young stallions, and there's a social hierarchy within the bachelor group. There's a highest ranking stallion and the next ranking. They'll do mutual grooming. They get along with one another, and one by one, they will find themselves some mares and start their own band.
After centuries of genetic isolation and adaptation to the American West, the horses that returned with the Spaniards developed into a distinct population or breed, commonly known as the Mustang. They are between 13 and 15 hands tall, with smooth muscles and short backs. The girth is deep with laid-back shoulder and pronounced withers. They have a rounded rump with low-set tails. Feet are small, round, and extremely tough with thick walls. And they possess the classic Spanish-type head with a straight or concave forehead and a convex nose. This distinct population or breed became known by many names: elk dog, Indian pony, buffalo runner, Texas cow pony, and Spanish Mustang. All these names describe the same horse, North America's native wild horse.
Over 400 or 500 years, its evolution since its return to North America has made us far more biologically fit than any domestic horse we've ever put our hands on. They had to become smarter. They had to become more adaptable. They had to group themselves socially for their protection. Their conformation is simply a function of what's going to keep them alive. If their hind legs are further under their rear end than in a domestic horse, it's because maybe they needed a fast start to get away from a mountain lion. Clearly, their intelligence is way out in front of the domestic horse. The American wild horse is essentially hardwired to the American West. That was its point of origin. That was the location for close to 1 million years of evolution. It is no wonder that it has done so well here in North America after its return, because this is its home. It returned home.
The horse thrived in its native homeland, but the horse's natural habitat was about to undergo unprecedented transformation. The immigrants who colonized America never left home. They brought home with them. British colonists arrived with a mission to create a new Europe. The old and familiar would replace the strange and the unknown. European plants, animals, and religion would replace virgin forests, open prairie, and native people. Europeans believed that an untamed wilderness was displeasing to God. They served God by overcoming nature. This worldview would not bode well for America's wild horse. The first colonists were incredibly optimistic. They believed that European religion and culture were so obviously superior, they would be quickly adopted by the native people. In time, their optimism faded. The Indians' reluctance to sing Protestant hymns and eat at tables with knives and forks was seen by many as sinful in the eyes of God.
The hand of God was eminently seen in thinning the Indians to make room for the English. It pleased Almighty God to send unusual sicknesses amongst them, as the smallpox, to lessen their numbers.
Wave after wave of European diseases swept across America, decimating Indian populations. Young America was a tiny cog in a very large machine, the British Empire. We supplied England with furs, food, tobacco, timber, and cotton, making England wealthier and more powerful. At the heart of all empires is an unshakable belief in superiority. British shoes were seen as superior to Indian moccasins. British homes were superior to Indian homes, and British horses were superior to Indian horses. England had a deeply ingrained cultural and aesthetic bias against short horses. King Henry VIII killed all the horses in England under 13 hands tall. This bias crossed the ocean in wooden boats. In the north, William Penn, being of a more gentle nature, had short horses gelded. But in the South, economic opportunity overrode biases against short horses. Trading Mustangs became big business. As early as 1720, French colonists in Louisiana began to send expeditions into the southwestern plains to take Indians as slaves and to capture Mustangs for their cavalry. This set the stage for the great southern horse trade of the 18th and 19th century.
Starting in the 1780s, in Louisiana, primarily among the Spanish and French families there, including my own family, these Euro-Americans began making expeditions out onto the southern plains to groups like the Comanches, the Kiowas, the Cheyennes, and others, and either trading for horses or sometimes building corrals and actually running wild horses and capturing Mustangs themselves and bringing them back from the southern prairies across the Mississippi River and trading them to the advancing American frontier, primarily in the American South in places like Kentucky and Tennessee. They not only went to Anglo-American frontiersmen, but Southeastern Indians bought them. This is how, for example, groups like the Seminoles acquired their horses. The Seminoles become famous, of course, for their horses in Florida. Those horses came from the southwestern prairies originally. So there was a market to the Indians, the Creeks, the Cherokees, the Seminoles, the members of the 5 civilized tribes, primarily to use as riding horses. That trade, although it was illegal, it was a contraband trade that the Spaniards in the Southwest attempted to suppress and stop.
it nonetheless was a volume trade, amounted to something like 1,000 animals a month for decade after decade, flowing out of the southern plains into the American South, and really was kind of the counterpoint of the fur trade on the northern plains.
Euro-Americans believed that Indians forfeited their rights to their ancestral lands because they failed to use the land as God intended.
There can be no doubt that the Creator intended the earth should be reclaimed from a state of nature and cultivated.
Pressures created by a rapidly swelling population rekindled the debate about Native Americans' right to live on their tribal lands.
They have neither the intelligence, the industry, the moral habits, nor the desire for improvement. Established in the midst of a superior race, they must necessarily yield to the force of circumstance and ere long disappear.
By the mid-1800s, Euro-Americans outnumbered Native Americans 100 to 1, and European immigrants were pouring in at an alarming rate, almost 2 million a year. An attitude of entitlement soon swept the nation. Euro-Americans believed they had the right to occupy the entire continent. This belief became known as manifest destiny. Manifest destiny was the battle cry of westward expansion and the death knell for everything in its path. Migratory Indians, buffalo, and free-roaming wild horses. An ultimatum was issued to all Indians: reservation or extermination.
To make it known to all of said Indians as the settled and inflexible policy of the government that they are to go upon said reservations, that they are to have no alternative but to choose between this policy and extermination.
The government was deadly serious about extermination. It set out to kill every man, woman, and child who would not abandon their ancestral lands.
The
plan was simple: destroy native food supplies, eradicate the buffalo, and kill the Indian ponies.
After the Battle of Palo Duro Canyon in 1874, Mackenzie captured 1,400 Indian ponies. He marched them to a canyon called Tule Canyon. Troopers were positioned on the rim rock all above and opened fire. Over the space of about an hour's time, those troopers shot down and killed more than 1,000 Indian horses. Mackenzie then went on to the Dakotas and Montana after the Battle of the Little Bighorn and did the same thing on the northern plains. This was the strategy that he used. Anytime you attacked an Indian camp, you just captured their winter supplies, captured their horse herds, and killed all the horses. So the strategy of killing horse herds was really one of the ways that these commanders learned how to defeat the Indians in the Plains Wars.
By the late 1800s, Euro-Americans got the land. Surviving Indians got reservations. And the U.S. government inherited millions of free-roaming wild horses.
The whole cowboy experience in the West was, I think, far more multi-ethnic than we've ever considered it to be. It was a world that, in actual history, consisted of not just Anglo-Americans, but a large number of Hispanics, particularly since they were the teachers of cowboying in the beginning. All the trail drives always featured as many as 20% who were Hispanic. And after African Americans were freed in the United States, one of the jobs that they took up in large numbers in the West was working as cowboys, not only hired hands for ranches, but working as drovers on cattle drives.
Farewell, fair ladies, I'm a leaving Cheyenne. Farewell, fair ladies, I'm a leaving Cheyenne.
The original cowboys rode Mustangs straight out of the wild. They lived on the open range, roaming from one drive to the next. The first cattle drives were long and arduous, and Euro-American breeds were not up to the task. Cowboys, trappers, mountain men, the Pony Express, anyone requiring horses with stamina, endurance, and sure-footedness all rode Mustangs. As drives became shorter, endurance was less important, and Euro-American breeds were used. The original cow pony, the Mustang, was then bred with taller horses to move closer to a European aesthetic. America no longer had an Indian problem. But from the viewpoint of the federal government, we still had an Indian pony problem, both on reservations and on the millions of acres of native land now under the control of the American government. Indians on reservations held on to their traditional relationship to the horse. Most of their grassland was used to graze their horses. The government insisted that the Indians replace their horses with something more economically viable: cattle. Over the next 2 decades, the problem was quietly resolved. More than 40,000 horses belonging to Native Americans on reservations were systematically exterminated.
The federal government comes in and sees these big horse herds that Native peoples have. They then come in and say that they have some kind of disease, and so that they're ordered to exterminate all these horse herds. So my great-grandmother goes down and talks to the horses like they were real people. Well, they were people to her. My great-grandmother sings final songs for these horses that are about ready to be slaughtered. She sings a death song.
In the early 1900s, Euro-American breeds became quite the rage. This reinforced the bias favoring taller, pedigreed horses. As well-bred horses pranced in holiday parades, America was becoming an industrial giant. Mechanized farming and motorized transportation completely changed our relationship to the horse. The horse became obsolete, replaced by the internal combustion engine.
As the automotive and mechanical age dawned, horses were at that time becoming regarded as a burden on the agricultural economy. One use that the economy found for horses was shooting them, setting them out as bait, and lacing the carcasses with strychnine in order to poison wolves and coyotes.
Federal agricultural agencies targeted the wild horse as an exotic, invasive species which competed with livestock. Their goal was clear: to annihilate the Mustang. Many communities organized Mustang hunting parties. These were festive events which brought neighbors together against a common foe. Individual farmers and ranchers shot and poisoned wild horses or ran them over cliffs. Large numbers of hunters and Mustangers were hired to kill horses. Wild stallions were shot and replaced by properly bred studs in order to improve the wild horse herds. More than 1 million wild horses from the American West were shipped overseas to South Africa for Britain's Boer War. Over 300,000 American Mustangs were delivered to our European allies during World War I. After the war, cavalry horses were on the surplus market, and many were sold as a delicacy to butcher shops in France and Germany. Europeans found a use for the remaining horses: pet food. Thousands of tons of American horses were eaten by European cats and dogs.
In 1921, a company called Kennel Ration founded the first canned pet food company in the United States. They began to use horses as the primary ingredient in canned dog food. And so Kennel Ration sets off what becomes an enormous growth industry in something like 29 million pounds of canned pet food a year are sold in the United States, and much of that is made up of horse meat from slaughtered horses. Some of them old domesticated animals that are sold, but increasingly this becomes the destination of the remnant wild horses in the American West.
The wild horse, which lived in North America for over 1 million years, was now on the verge of disappearing. Throughout our history, the wild Mustang has played a vital role in Native American and Hispanic culture, and has been championed by many prominent Anglo-Americans as well. Thomas Jefferson was fascinated with wild horses. He believed that Mustangs offered us an opportunity to study horses in their natural, pre-domesticated state. John Audubon held the Euro-American bias against wild Mustangs until he rode one He wrote that these horses could cross rivers without prodding and jump over logs like elk. Audubon suggested that Mustangs should be used to upbreed European horses. Bob Brislon and his son Emmett dedicated their lives to preserving the Spanish Mustang. For 3 decades, Bob worked for the United States Geological Survey, surveying remote areas of the West on horseback. His team of horses included 2 Indian ponies, Ping and Pong. These ponies had twice the endurance of the finest cavalry horses. They were more sure-footed, more intelligent, and more perceptive. Bob came to realize that these ponies were among the last of their kind.
That's why he got to preserving them, was because when they went to replace them horses, there wasn't any left. They started realizing there wasn't no more of them horses. They was gone.
In 1911, Bob began to preserve the Spanish Mustang. Years later, Bob and Emmett combed pueblos and reservations to find the Spanish Indian ponies preserved by Native Americans. They also obtained Mustangs living in the wild. Over several decades, they put together a preservation herd, and in the late 50s, their efforts culminated with the founding of the Spanish Mustang Registry. The Brislon horses are semi-wild. They are allowed to breed naturally and live in family bands. Many additional registries and organizations now preserve the American Mustang of Spanish descent, which lived wild in the American West for centuries.
They got into a Kentucky bar at the head of Whiskey Road and landed up at Depot House some 40 drinks below.
In the early 1950s, Velma Johnson, known as Wild Horse Annie, began fighting the inhumane treatment and slaughter of Mustangs. Velma asked America to take a hard look at the culture of cruelty surrounding the harvesting of Mustangs. Mustangs were being run to death by aircraft, tied to spare tires, strangled with wire, dragged to death behind trucks, slashed, starved, and tortured. In 1971, Congress passed the Free Roaming Horse and Burro Act, which set guidelines for the management of wild horses. Much of the abuse and mismanagement of wild horses stems from their misclassification as a non-native, exotic species. In the early 90s, DNA research set the record straight. Humans only recently migrated to North America, having lived here for about 13,000 years. Ancestors of bison, moose, and bighorn sheep immigrated here much earlier, about 150,000 years ago. But the modern horse did not immigrate here at all. It co-evolved with North America. From the perspective of deep time ecology, Its recent absence of 7,000 years is irrelevant, representing less than 0.5% of the species' age. Mitochondrial DNA analysis completely discredits the assertion that horses are not native to America. From a scientific frame of reference, DNA research ended the debate about the origins of the modern horse. But from a political point of view, antiquated beliefs die slowly. America is engaged in a range war. More than 50 million big game animals, cattle, and sheep graze on public land, competing with fewer than 35,000 wild horses. The wild horse has little economic value. Hunting, cattle, oil, and mining, however, are big business, and consider wild horses a nuisance, or worse. These large and influential industries contribute billions of dollars a year to our economy and hold great sway over federal policy. Although horse populations are relatively small, many hunters, ranchers, and environmentalists want to minimize competition with big game, cattle, or more favored wildlife species. They want to reduce horse herds or eliminate wild horses entirely. When we think of native wildlife, we picture elk, bighorn sheep, or moose, not horses. Yet this image is very far from the truth. Elk, moose, and bighorn sheep are not native to America. Their ancestors evolved in Europe and Asia. From a deep time ecology perspective, elk, moose, and bighorn sheep are recent arrivals. These Asian species successfully adapted to the horse's native habitat, a habitat fashioned by more than 1 million years of coevolution with the North American horse. The North American horse is one of the few truly native wildlife species alive in America today. In spite of advances in scientific understanding, many government agencies still manage wild horses as livestock and not as native wildlife. In nature, horse populations are kept in check by their natural predators, coyotes, wolves, bears, and mountain lions. This finely tuned balance has been upset both by predator eradication programs and shrinking native habitat. Federal agencies address the resulting overpopulation by penning up wild horses. This policy is extremely controversial. Many claim that the process of trapping and incarcerating wild horses is unnecessarily violent and inhumane. Family structure is paramount to wild horses, and many are injured or killed trying to reconnect with their family bands. Today, more than 1/2 of America's remaining wild horses are no longer allowed to live as native wildlife. Most will live out their lives in containment facilities. As young children, we are taught that all horses are domesticated animals, not wildlife. Childhood myths are difficult to shed.
One of the problems most people have when they see wild horses is that they think they're seeing a domestic horse living on its own up on a mountaintop. They're not. They're seeing a true wild animal that gets no veterinary care, gets no supplemental feeding. It's really something very different. But it's so hard for people to shed that projection from a domestic horse onto what they see out on the range. It's just so difficult, and you can't appreciate wild horses until you really look at them as a wildlife species.
Much of what Aldo Leopold knew of the American wilderness, he learned while on the back of a Mustang. As the father of wildlife ecology, he advocated that native species be given preference in management and taught us profound respect for wildlife, such as the horse, whose history in America extends back millions of years. We now understand that the horse, Equus caballus, is perhaps the oldest native North American large mammal alive today.
The horse is actually one of the few animals in the American West whose evolutionary origins are here. It came from 57 million years of evolution in North America. And so if any animal is a native species to North America, it's the horse.
The North American horse is the epitome of perseverance. It coexisted with woolly mammoths, was eaten by saber-toothed tigers, and was hunted by predators with stone-tipped spears. Still, it survives. It has been run off cliffs, canned for pet food, and hunted from aircraft. Yet it endures. It has been slandered, deliberately misclassified, and delegitimized, but it perseveres. The horse co-evolved with North America, and in spite of overwhelming odds, it still survives, wild in its own homeland.
Los mancebos visten chapines de lustrín y este viejo malo chapeo de poplín. Mancebos llevan camisas sirmalí y este viejo malo viste manjagli. Los mancebos visten fes maquinali y este